What do you think of the phrase, seeing is believing? Or if we could word it a little bit differently, what do you think of the phrase, hearing is believing? Hi, I'm Ken Yates from Grace Evangelical Society, and I would just like to spend a few minutes talking about that, whether those phrases are true or not. Believing something is being convinced that it is true. And yes, you can see something and be convinced that what you're seeing is true. Or you can hear something, and what you hear, you're convinced that it is true. But that's not always the case. Take, for example, the phrase, seeing is believing. You may see something, but you don't believe it's true. You're not convinced that it's true. For example, if you watch a magician and he does something with a rabbit and the rabbit disappears, you see it, but you don't believe that rabbit has disappeared. You know, there's some kind of trick. It's still in the hat or wherever that rabbit went. It didn't disappear. A sports fan will watch his team lose a game, but he will not be convinced that the other team is better than his team. He might say, for example, that the referees cheated, or he might say that the best player on his team was sick. And so he still has the better team. He's still rooting for the better team, even though the other team won and his team lost. It's the same thing with us. We can hear something and believe it, but we can also hear the same person talking and not believe it. For example, even in the case of Christ, we can read his words and hear his words in that sense that he offers eternal life to everyone who believes in him for it. And we're convinced it's true, and we know we have eternal life. We hear what he says and we believe it. But then we can hear something else he says and not be convinced it's true. For example, when Jesus says that we ought to forgive the brother who sins against us 70 times, 7 times, we can hear that. Well, we may say, I don't believe that. I don't think that's in my best interest. Or when Jesus says that he's going to reward us if we are faithful to him, if we suffer with him, we may not believe that either. We see a picture of this in the disciples in the New Testament. They are people who believe that Jesus was the Christ. They were convinced that he was the one who gives them eternal life. But throughout the Gospels, they hear Jesus say things, hard things for them to comprehend, and they're not convinced that what he is saying is true. We see an example of that in Mark chapter 7. All of these disciples were Jewish, and all their lives they had been told that the food that they ate was something that could either make them clean or make them defiled religiously. But Jesus says that's not the case. There's nothing that goes inside of a man that will defile him. This was something completely radical for them, and they have a hard time understanding it. And Jesus tells them, you need to hear what I'm saying to you. What he's saying is you need to believe it. In Mark chapter 7, verse 14, it says that he called them to him and said, hear me and understand what I'm telling you and believe it. And he also says the same thing in verse 16. He says in verse 16, if anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. So 3 times we have this verb, hear. What's great about this is right after that, we have the account of someone else who hears the words of Christ. But this person is not like the disciples. She's not Jewish, and she's not a man, and she's not following Jesus around every day. But even though that's the case, and even though she's not living in Israel, she's heard him. In Mark chapter 7, verse 24, Mark tells us that she heard about him. Jesus is in her hometown, in a town called Tyre. She's a Syro-Phoenician woman. She's a Gentile woman. How does she hear about him? Well, in Mark chapter 3, we're told that Jesus performed many miracles in Galilee. And it says that there were people from Tyre there who saw him and heard him speak. Now, whether she was one of them who was visiting or whether her neighbors who had been there returned and told her, they had told her about this man. She had heard about him. She had heard the things that he had said and heard the things that he had done. And that's what Mark means when he says she heard. Remember, just a few verses earlier, he told the disciples, hear me, hear me. Well, this woman has heard. And in the Gospel of Matthew, we're told one of the things she heard was that he was the Christ, and she believes it because in Matthew, she calls him, you son of David. But there's something else this woman has heard. This woman has heard that he's able to cast out demons and heal the sick. And that's very important to her because she has a daughter who's possessed by a demon. And she knows, she's convinced that he's able to cast this demon out of her daughter. And that's why she's there. And she comes to him and says, ask him to do that for her. And Jesus puts her to the test. He says, my priority is with my disciples. These are the children. I don't have time for you. You're like in a family where you have children and you have dogs, and it's not right to take the food from the children and give it to the dogs. He's not being a racist. He's just simply saying, you're not my priority. My disciples are. But what's great about this woman is what she has heard about him lets her know how great his power is. Because she says, yes, Lord, I am. That is exactly what I am. But you are so great that the bread that you feed your children, even the crumbs, is enough to meet the needs of my daughter as well. What she was saying is, I've heard about you. I've heard what you said. And I know that you're the son of David. And I know that you have this power. And I know that you have enough power to minister to your disciples and my daughter at the same time. Matthew says that when she said that, Jesus says, woman, your faith is great. She heard things and she was convinced that they were true. She heard things more than that he was just the son of David, which he was. But that's how great he was. Mark tells us that Jesus tells her, your daughter is healed. And Jesus doesn't go to her home. He just simply says the word, and she hears that. And that's enough. And she goes home, and her daughter was healed. She is the only person in the Gospel of Mark that experiences a healing in that way, over a distance, where Jesus didn't have to touch the person, where Jesus didn't have to be there. The woman believed that Jesus was able to do that. She was convinced it was true. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you have believed that he is the one who gives you eternal life. You know you'll never lose it. But as we study the scriptures, we're going to learn more things from him. We're going to hear more things from him. And Mark gives us this woman here in Mark chapter 7 as an outstanding example that when you hear the Lord say something, even if it's radical to you and even if it's strange, like it was for the disciples, let us be like this woman instead. When we hear the words of the Lord, let us be convinced that it is true. If you like what you've heard, I would ask that you would press the like button. And if you really like it, press the subscribe button. And remember, keep grace in focus.